Hi guys. Okay, so after reading this passage, the main idea that stood out to me throughout the whole reading was the idea of being in exile. Hubbard uses the experience of the Israelis in Babylon to explain how Christians can live in a place that is not their ultimate home while still being called to love that place, serve the people there, and trust God with the amount of time that they have there. I chose 6 sentences that really stood out to me and that were very insightful to me, or challenging as well. My first quote comes from the beginning of the reading when Hubbard introduces the idea of living somewhere that you want to leave. The sentence I chose is, "Some places we love and some places we want to leave." I thought it was I thought this was very significant because I think that most people can relate to being in a season in their life where they're not necessarily wanting to stay in. Sometimes we become so focused on where we want to go next that we forget to appreciate where we are now. We might think, I'll be happier, whenever I graduate. I'll be happier whenever I get this new job. I'll be happier whenever I finally go to the next stage in my life. And you're not really focusing on what life is bringing you right now. This part challenged me because it made me think about how easy it is for me to constantly look forward to the next thing. I don't think that there's anything wrong with having goals and setting those goals, but I don't want to spend so much time waiting for my future that I miss what God is doing right now in my present day. My second quote comes from the section where Hubbard discusses the Israelis in Babylon. The passage that stood out to me is where God tells the exiles to build houses and live in them, plant gardens, and eat their produce. This context is very important to me because they really wanted to go home. They didn't want to become comfortable there because they knew that that wasn't their true home. However, God instructed them to actually live there and focus on, harvesting where they are and where they are in life right now, and appreciate the city and participate in the things that the community has to give to them. This stood out to me because I think sometimes we assume that if we are in an uncomfortable season, God must want us to get out of it immediately. But this passage shows that sometimes God allows us to remain somewhere for a period of time because there's something that he wants us to do there. For me, I feel like I'm in that season right now. Oh my God, I don't want to cry. I feel like I'm in that season right now. So I think that this really stood out to me because it challenged me and it made me think that, I have been impatient for something, and I become so focused on what that next chapter is that I don't even stop to ask God or try to listen and, for him to teach me and for me to learn in the season that I'm in. My third quote comes from Hubbard's discussion about how God plants his people where he wants them. One idea that stood out to me was that God is the one who ultimately determines where his people are planted. The context that the Israelis probably didn't understand why God had allowed them to be taken to Babylon. From their perspective, Babylon was not where they wanted to be, but God had a purpose even in that uncomfortable situation. I found this challenging because I don't always understand why certain things happen in my life. Sometimes I want an explanation before I'm willing to trust God, but this reading reminded me that not understanding God's plan doesn't mean that he does not have a plan. He always has a plan, and I fully need to think that my faith requires trusting God even when I can't see the entire picture, even whenever I may not understand why I'm in a certain season, but that doesn't mean that the season is just meaningless. My fourth quote from the section is about how putting down roots while living as an exile. Hubbard talks about how God's people shouldn't live as though they are leaving tomorrow. Instead, they should put down roots where God has placed them. This was probably one of the most challenging ideas for me because I think it's very easy to mentally live in the future. Especially now, there's always something, going on. There's always the next new thing, the next big thing, so it's kind of hard to really study on the moment that you're in. Sometimes we can be physically present somewhere but mentally already somewhere else. We're thinking about the next job, the next relationship, the next semester, the next house, the next car, or whatever we believe would make our life better. But Hubbard's point is that even if we know we won't be somewhere forever, that doesn't mean we should invest in it. You know, that really made me think about how I spend my time. If I believe that God has placed me somewhere right now, then I should ask myself, what can I do to make this place better, instead of only thinking like, when can I leave? Like, when can I go to the next season, you know? And my fifth quote comes from about seeking the welfare of the city. The passage I chose from Jeremiah's command to the exiles to seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you. The context is really important because God wasn't simply telling the Israelis to survive Babylon. He was telling them to seek the good of the place where they lived. I really like this because it changes the way I think about being a Christian in the world. Being an exile doesn't mean separating ourselves from everyone around us, or deciding that because this world isn't our permanent home, nothing here matters. Instead, it means we should actually care about the people around us. I think that this can apply to everyday life, whether you're in school or in work or your neighborhoods. We have an opportunity to make a positive difference. Even if we know we're eventually going somewhere else, our time where we are still matters. And my final quote that stood out to me is, Christians ultimately have a home that is not here on earth. Our temporary homes can be meaningful, but they aren't our final destination. This was significant to me because it gives a different perspective on life. We can love our families, our careers, our homes, our communities, and the different places that God allows us to live in, while still remembering that none of those things are permanent. It reminds me that I shouldn't place all of my hope in what happens here. Everything in this life is going to change. People are going to change. Jobs going to change. Circumstances might change. Relationships might change. But eventually our time here does have to come to an end. But according to the Christian faith, our relationship with God and the hope of being with Him forever, that is ultimately going to last. So the question of, do I agree? I do agree with the author's main point. I agree because I think that the idea of being in an exile doesn't mean that Christians are supposed to hate the world or hate where we live. Instead, it recognizes that this world is temporary and that our ultimate home is with God. What I really appreciate about the reading is he doesn't use being in exile as an excuse to disconnect with the world. Instead, he explains that we should actually love the place where God has placed us. We should build, plant, and serve, and work, and develop relationships, and seek good for the people around us. For me, the biggest lesson from this reading is that temporary doesn't mean meaningless. So, thank you for listening.